Good evening, good evening. Hello, everyone. Let me share on the main page. All right. Let me see. I get my type on. Come join us over at, there we go, for our weekly COVID-19 updates. All right, there we go. Good evening, good evening. How are we? Let me get a sip of my tea. My cup is almost empty. So I'm gonna have to sip real slow. So much going on this week in terms of COVID. My goal, I say this every week, but my weeks get busy and so I can't do it, is to segment out the sections of our weekly talks so that I can at least post in short segments the highlights. There should be like a highlights reel, right? But especially for a conversation like tonight where we're going to be touching a couple of different things. Good evening, Miss Worthy. Good evening, good evening. Good evening, beautiful. How are you? And also, if I'm a little squinty today, there was a lot of computer time today. I try to give my eyes a little bit of rest before jumping on every Wednesday evening. But Wednesdays end up being my busiest day, and I'm not going to complain about that. So, you guys know what we do. I'll get started. I'm going to jump right in because there's a lot I want us to be able to cover. Just when I thought I'd be transitioning out of like frequent COVID conversations and into like other health and wellness topics, shows up Delta, right? I was talking with a friend of mine. I said, of course, thus far, the Delta variant has to be the biggest, baddest variant there is as of yet. Not that I take pride in it being, thank you, sweetheart. I received that. Not that I want to brag about the Delta one being the biggest, baddest, because I really would have been perfectly content with it being a variant of interest and not even concern. But here we are. And because of the Delta variant, our numbers are all over the place, all right? So the long and the short of it is get vaccinated or mask, not even or, get vaccinated and mask up. So even if you're vaccinated, if you're spending any time indoors, you need to still have your mask on. I don't care. Tried not to cuss. I was about to cuss. I don't care what the CDC says. You put your mask on, all right? Especially with this Delta variant being the predominant one spreading throughout the country and throughout the globe. You guys know what we do. We go through our numbers first. We look at our metrics. We look at our trends, and then we go into the meat of our conversation. A lot of our focus is going to be on the Delta variant. There's some conversation that we need to have about Johnson & Johnson and another concern in terms of adverse outcomes, particularly the Guillain-Barre. So we're going to talk about that. I want to make sure I put that out there so I do not forget to mention it. But we'll definitely be talking about that. As I mentioned earlier, what I'm going to try to do after this, and I say it every week, but time just escapes me, and then here it is Wednesday again, is to segment it into chunks so that I can post it like on Instagram and stuff so that people can watch it, and also to try to remember my best to convert these over to YouTube so that those of us who have family members who are not on Facebook or any other form of social media, perhaps they will watch it through YouTube, because right now it's of the utmost importance that people have a full understanding of what they are at risk for in the face of this variant, especially among those who are not vaccinated. Not to be all, ooh, things are bad, but we are dealing with a bigger, badder version of COVID now than we were back in 2020. The reason why things were so bad in 2020 is because this was brand new to all of us. But now that a good chunk of us, the majority of us now have been vaccinated, it makes the population that COVID has to infect much smaller, and it's a smaller population, therefore the risk is increased, and then the risk increases even more because this particular variant, the Delta variant, is more infectious and associated with a higher level of risk of hospitalization and illness severity. So those are the reasons why, if anyone is on the fence about getting vaccinated, why you should strongly consider it, because the longer you wait, especially if you're able to get it, I understand there's some folks with medical conditions where there are some concerns, but if you are otherwise healthy, we're seeing people in their 30s, their 40s, dying of COVID in the same way we did at the beginning of the pandemic. So we really have to keep that in mind. But we'll jump into more of that conversation in a little bit. But I want to make sure that we talk through some of the reasons why I'm like, we need to really consider getting vaccinated. All right. So let's jump into numbers. So the way that we do this is we're going to jump into our numbers first, talk about where we are from a number standpoint, talk about our metrics in terms of knowing what's going on as it relates to COVID-19 spread. And then we'll talk about some of these other more important, equally as important, but really in-depth topics. All right. So from a global standpoint, we are now at a little over 189 million cases, 111 million cases across the globe. We are seeing COVID-19 numbers increase more. We started to see a significant decline back in May through June with the rise of the Delta variant coming out of India. We started to see a slight increase up in June, but we're seeing significant increases in terms of COVID-19 numbers across the globe, particularly in countries that have very low vaccination rates. I don't know if you guys have seen some of the scary things that are happening out of South Africa. The entire continent of Africa was not, thankfully, disproportionately impacted by the pandemic as a whole in comparison to the United States, India, Brazil, etc. But now, with less than 5% of the population throughout the continent of Africa being vaccinated, what we are concerned about is a shift in terms of who is now going to be impacted, because your vaccination status, your personal one, your city, your country, etc., is going to determine how impactful the Delta variant is going to be. And what I can tell you, based on what we're seeing out of South Africa, if that gives us a hint of what may transpire in other parts of the continent, we really have to dedicate efforts to make sure that there's equitable access to this vaccine across the globe, because as goes India, so goes the United States, right? COVID-19 was annihilating India a couple of months ago, and out of it was birthed the Delta variant. And so although people can say, oh, well, that's happening in the continent of Africa, that doesn't impact or infect or affect us. Absolutely it does, because if some crazy, ridiculous variant gets birthed out of South Africa, guess where it's going to show up? At some point in time, it's going to show up on our borders, because as we've said over and over again, COVID-19 is not respective of city, county, state, or country borders. And, historically, we have not been able to get ahead in terms of closing country borders in terms of travel without there at least being some of these variants showing up in the United States. And so we're not immune to the variants that develop in other countries. They show up right here in the good old US of A. And what makes a difference is how well we collectively and individually are protected against COVID-19 by way of vaccine. And if you're not ready for it, then wear your mask, please and thank you. All right. So that's where we are in terms of our global numbers. We are still doing fairly well, right, in terms of the number of people who have died from COVID-19 recently. I'll say that in terms of the rate of rise, how many people are dying from COVID-19 has certainly slowed down globally and here in the United States. Last week, we were at a little over 4 million. We were at 4,016,000 people who had lost their lives across the globe. We are now at 4,073,000 people who have lost their lives. And there was a point in time where it was like going up by the 50,000s, even by 100,000 from week to week. So the fact that we are only having an increase of a little under 60,000 within a week's period of time means that things are trending well in terms of deaths. Now, remember, what we always talk about is that death rise is delayed by about 2 to 3 weeks after cases go up, right? We know that with COVID-19 cases, it's not like 100% of people are going to get COVID and 100% are going to recover. We know that the current death rate, looking at the entire experience of the pandemic, the death rate is around 2%. So for every 100 people who get COVID, 2 of them will die. As the Delta variant spreads throughout the globe and cases go up, death numbers will also increase but it will be delayed by about 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks from now, we're going to see significant increase in death numbers simply because we are seeing a significant increase in the number of cases, all right? In terms of us here at home, we're close to 35 million cases of COVID. We're at 34.8 million cases of COVID-19 here in the United States. We are now at 623,000 people who have lost their lives. A slow increase in terms of the number of people who've died, and we'll talk about that a little bit when it comes to trends. Just last week, we were at close to 622,000 individuals. We are now at 740,000 people who have lost their lives to COVID. And again, I want to make sure that you guys understand a point of reference. The largest number of people that we've lost annually to influenza has been no more than about 60,000 people. So 10% of the people we've lost from COVID have been what we've lost in terms of influenza. And I know you'll say, oh, Dr. Hancock, the pandemic started in March. That's not fair. You're comparing a 16-month, almost 17-month period of time to a 12-month period of time. I'll gift you that. But even if we do 500,000, which is where we were at the year mark, that's still significantly more than the total number of people per season that we lose with influenza. So I just want to make sure that we have a good sense of how impactful this pandemic has been. In terms of the average daily number of new cases, the metrics that we look at, so it's the average daily number of new cases, the goal being less than 25. To be honest with you, the goal needs to be for all of us to be in the green zone, less than one case per 100,000. But we're not going to get there anytime soon until we have reached significant herd immunity. But for right now, it's good to monitor to see where your state is, right? So this allows us to compare apples to apples. How is New York compared to New Jersey, compared to Connecticut, etc.? So that's our first metric. The second metric that we look at is our percent positive. Of all the testing being done to identify patients with COVID-19, how many of those tests come up positive? So let's talk about our daily average number of new cases to see how we're doing. Red zone is the zone we want to avoid, right? That means that we have surpassed the 25 per 100. For the past, I would say probably 2 months, we have not had a state in the red zone until today. We today, as of today, have 2 states in the red zone. Anyone want to take a wild guess as to what those 2 states are? One state, I'm not surprised because they're always wilding out. The other state slowly crept up, and I was surprised to see it because it hadn't been, it had been high in terms of percent positives, but in terms of daily average number of new cases, we had done fairly well. Florida. Florida tops the country in terms of the new cases over a 7-day average. They are at 34.7 new cases per 100,000 residents in the state of Florida. Exactly, not to be surpassed too horribly by Arkansas. Arkansas is number 2. The U.S. Virgin Islands is not too far behind. So Florida and Arkansas are the top states within the states and territories here in the United States. Averaging for Florida, 34.7 new cases per 100,000. I need Florida to get it together. And then Arkansas at 32.5. Last week we had a handful of states in the orange zone. That's anywhere between 10 to 24 new cases per 100,000 residents. We now have 11 states in the orange zone. Those states top out at Missouri, and Missouri by this time next week will likely be in the red zone because they're at 24.9. They're hanging by the skin of their teeth, right? They're hanging by a thread in the orange zone. They will likely be in the red zone next week. And one of the biggest concerns, particularly in a state like Missouri, is that they've just pushed out reports just this week talking about the age demographics of those who are newly infected. And we're talking teens and young adults between the ages of 18 and 39 are hardest hit in the state of Missouri. And it also is reflective of the lowest percentage of those who have been vaccinated. The 18 to 29-year-old group specifically has the least amount of vaccinations in that population. So it's not surprising, especially in these low vaccination states, that our younger populations are the ones showing up to get diagnosed with COVID and the ones who are being hospitalized because of COVID. Those states that top out in the orange zone are Nevada, Louisiana, come on home state, Utah, Oklahoma, Wyoming, the Virgin Islands, Kansas, Alabama, Mississippi, and Alaska. Alaska, we just threw it in there, right? But the majority of the states that we're seeing are in the South and in the Midwest. And what's interesting is that what we're observing is there are like these political lines that perfectly overlay the states with the new cases, the states with the lowest vaccination rates, and the states with the highest number of cases throughout the country. So we definitely have to keep an eye out on what's going on there. In terms of the yellow zone, that's anywhere between 1 to 9 cases of COVID per 100,000 residents. We have 41 states in the yellow zone. Yay us. We had 43 last week, but I'm still celebrating the fact that the majority of the states within the country are in the yellow zone. And then we have one state in the green zone, and it's not Vermont this time. I'm surprised. Vermont is actually in the yellow zone, but at 1.1 case per 100,000. Iowa is actually reporting that it is in the green zone. I don't know if I buy it. I think Iowa's not reporting out their numbers because if you guys remember, every single week that we report out percent positives, Iowa has been greater than 5% positive in terms of testing. So how do they go from being one of the 5 states that's consistently been in having greater than 5% of their testing being positive to now being in the green zone? That data I would question, but I'm not in their books. I don't know how they're managing their data, but they're reporting out 0.3 new cases per 100,000 residents. I'm gonna give y'all a little eyebrow because, yeah, Iowa is not more than just full of corn, y'all. But I digress. So let's talk percent positives. Of the states that are testing consistently, right? Because not all the states are reporting out what they should be. But this is the question that I get asked often. Can we trust the reporting of percent positive? Now, daily new cases, I don't know that we can trust it because it's really dependent on the states to report out their new cases. And for a variety of reasons, particularly to save face, right? No one wants to be like the typhoid Mary within the United States in terms of COVID-19 cases, knowing that they are not following the recommendations that they should. So they may not be as transparent. We've seen this. We saw this in Georgia. We saw this in Florida with misrepresenting the facts. Like they didn't lie. It's alternate facts. That's what 45 called it. So clearly some states have participated in those shenanigans. But the good thing with the percent positive is testing is testing. Whether you're doing 10 tests, 1,000 tests, or a million tests, there's still going to be a certain percent positive even in the testing that you do, regardless of the denominator. The question is, what is that numerator? How many of the tests that you are doing, however few you do, how many of those tests are showing up as positive? The goal is to have less than 5% of your testing be positive, right? We were celebrating for a while that none of the states were in the double digits. Only, I think last week, only 8 states were in the double digits past 10%. Well, I can't report that out anymore. Last week, there were only 12 states above 5%. This week, it's 18. 18 states are testing at higher than 5% positive testing. Arkansas, not surprisingly, leads in terms of their testing. Almost 40%, 38.7% of their COVID-19 testing has been positive, followed by Kansas. 23.8% of their testing has been positive. Alabama, 22.5%. Mississippi, I don't know why I had to sound real country when I said it, but I did. Mississippi at 22.4%. And then New Jersey. New Jersey sneaking in at 18.1%. And I'm not surprised because New York actually just reported out, I think they said that they had like a 20% increase in their COVID-19 cases since just last week, which shows us how quickly this Delta variant can transmit and cause increased cases. All right, I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. The less you test, the lower your infection rate. Absolutely. That's exactly what I think is going on, right? Wink, wink, elbow, elbow, right? So that's what they're trying to do. But and that's again why it's important to have these federal mandates and federal requirements. Like if you're trying to get federal dollars to support state initiatives, then like if I was president, right? When I run, this will be my platform. But if I was president tomorrow, what I would do is require certain metrics to be reported out and there to be transparency in how that data is reported out if you want federally based funding for anything that you're trying to do, right? Infrastructure, healthcare, etc. It'll be that dangling carrot. If you want this federal government money, then I need to have all of your data and it be transparent. What you are not going to do is be point 0.3 in the green zone in terms of your daily average number of new cases, when just last week you were topping out the top 5 in terms of percent positive. So that's how I would run the country, right? Let's see. Yep, exactly. LA, I heard my mother is on a plane right now flying to Los Angeles to visit my little brother, and I did look at the numbers. I was like, you're going to get swabbed. I don't care if you did get your shot, you're getting swabbed when you get back home. So yeah, I've been paying attention to those numbers and seeing them creep up. The interesting thing is that even within cities, counties, and states, what we're going to see based on differences in vaccination penetrance, how many people are vaccinated in these areas, you're going to not see the whole state impacted, but you're going to see clusters of communities impacted, because there are going to be certain communities that are very well covered in terms of immunizations, and other communities where you're going to see them being hit very, very hard as it relates to COVID-19 infections, hospitalizations, and deaths. So let's talk trends. To talking about testing, right? Even though the Delta variant is out and about doing its thing, testing has been reduced by about 14%. And as we've talked before, instead of having these mass testing sites, now people's options are to go to a healthcare provider to get tested, to go to like a CVS, Walmart, etc. And it's really dependent on the hours of availability, right? They're still, for the most part, a lot of these places are still requiring appointments only in health department spaces. Can you just walk in and get tested? There is the option of at-home testing, but that also costs money. And so you're talking about cost and availability is part of the reason why we're seeing testing be reduced. But it's also sort of this attitude, particularly among those who are vaccinated, that you don't necessarily need to get tested if you're vaccinated. But what we do know, as we've talked about before, is that there will be, and I don't even like to use the word breakthrough cases as if it's unexpected. There is an expectation that there are people who have been vaccinated and they will still get COVID. The risk is significantly less than those who are unvaccinated, as we have seen with all of our numbers, but there's still a risk. And so if you know you've been exposed, you've been on a plane and people have been sharing their, pressurized cabin space with you, then you should probably get tested. If you know someone who's had COVID, been exposed to COVID, or has COVID, even in the face of a vaccine, you should get tested just so that you know what your status is, because we do know, at least based on this Delta variant, that there is a potential for you to spread as an asymptomatic carrier. So we have to keep that in mind. We also have to make sure that testing is available and affordable to every single person on the planet, right? In terms of new cases, we doubled our new cases since last week. Last week, we were averaging around 12,900 cases per day. As of today, we're averaging 25,600 new cases per day. We've gone up by 109%. Did y'all hear me? We went up in cases by 109%. Last week, we went up just a smidge by 14%. This week, we went up by 109%. That's a lot of percent, right? I want an increase in my income of 109%. I'm gonna claim it, but that's a lot of increase. But it's not like all across the country, COVID is going bananas. Like we're gonna go back to where we were in March. That's not the case. Again, it's based on how well your community, your county, your city, your state is vaccinated. That's going to determine how much of an ouch we feel based on the Delta variant being the dominant variant. What we have seen is that a lot of these increases in new cases have been upticks in specific areas because of low vaccination rates. Arkansas, Missouri, Texas, Florida, Nevada, Mississippi, Louisiana. And what's interesting is that you see this coincide with political affiliation, right? So now I'm not going to get on a political soapbox, but when we look at where our classic red states are, we are also seeing an increase in COVID-19 cases, hospitalizations, not yet deaths, but it's coming simply because of math, right? If cases increase, deaths are soon to follow 2 to 3 weeks later. And it's unfortunate that throughout this pandemic, it has been so politicized, but nothing should be worth your life. Your political position, your political perspective should not be worth risking your safety, right? And one of the things that we have to think about, and we'll talk about in a little bit, is what does this look like in terms of numbers, right? In terms of basic numbers, who's in the hospital, who's dying from COVID. That definitely reveals why we need to really rethink how we position ourselves simply based on our political views, because it's amazing to me how these things are lining up, all right? But certain areas in the country are doing phenomenally well. Shout out to the Northeast, Vermont, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Maine, all of that goodness. You guys are knocking it out of the park. And a good number of states on the West Coast. Here in the Mid-Atlantic, we're doing a pretty decent job, but the Midwest and particularly the southern states, ouch. We have to do better. And what's really scary, particularly in the southern states, is in the South is usually where our health disparities are worse. It's also where our healthcare coverage is worse. So it's like this trifecta of badness that really should necessitate anyone who lives in the South strongly considering protecting themselves, particularly communities of color, because that's who's going to be most heavily impacted, particularly by this Delta variant, all right? So let's talk about the number of people who are dying. Last week, we were averaging around 250 people dying from COVID a day. We had reached a really significant low in terms of the number of people who've died. We're now at 330, so a slight increase in terms of the number of people who are dying from COVID on a daily basis. But what I am hearing anecdotally in my doctor circles is that younger people are hospitalized and younger people are dying. Just recently, there was a nurse who was very vocal about her hesitancy and her concern about the vaccine, that the mRNA vaccine somehow integrates into your DNA, which she should know better. If she did take a microbiology class, she should know that that is not how that works. Unfortunately, she lost her life to COVID just 2 days ago, and her parents are in the ICU. An ER nurse lost her life to COVID just 2 days ago, and her parents are currently in the ICU. And so it's important for us to recognize the risk that we take, right? Now, you guys know I was not rolling up my sleeves back in December, but trust me, had I not gotten the vaccine when I did, certainly watching these numbers and how this Delta variant is playing out, there would have been no question as to the risk-benefit analysis and how I decided to proceed. You guys already know I didn't jump on board in December, January, February. I waited until, I believe it was the end of March when we made our 12-month anniversary of the pandemic, and we had reached 10% of the population having received the vaccine. And looking at the side effects and adverse outcomes, knowing what the risks were with COVID and the minor risk with the vaccine, it for me was a very straightforward decision and something that I fully support and answer any questions about. I don't debate it because I don't believe in arguing with people. It's really having thoughtful, deliberate, and respectable conversation about it, right? But if you told me in December that the Delta variant was going to be here in December, like if Delta was here in December, a sister would have rolled her sleeves up and gotten the shot even earlier, because this one I wouldn't want to play with. And I have family members who are not vaccinated, and it eats at me. Now, I won't say every day because I don't allow myself to stress like that, but it weighs on me that, especially in Louisiana, with vaccine rates being so low, the healthcare system being such a challenge, and my family members having comorbid conditions, what is the Russian roulette that they're playing in terms of not being vaccinated? And so that's where I am with that in terms of the number of people who are dying. In terms of hospitalizations, we have seen a slight increase in terms of the number of people being hospitalized from COVID, close to 17,000 last week. We are now at 19,700 people on a daily average basis being hospitalized. That's almost a 20% increase since 2 weeks ago. And you certainly, in a situation like the nurse losing her life, I don't want to ever be proven correct because someone had to lose their life. And I've seen a lot of people tweeting about it and like, well, where are you now with your position? Like, that's just rude and disrespectful. I won't ever do that to anybody. If you decided not to get vaccinated and you end up getting ill or unfortunately lose your life, I'm not rubbing it in anybody's face. Never. right? But it goes to question when someone has a position like that, that there are other people who, if they could have gotten the vaccine, they would have gotten it, but lost their lives because they were not yet able to get it. And so those are the kinds of things that really weigh on me that I think through, but certainly not making fun, making light of her transitioning, but really helping other people who had similar thought processes in fully understanding the risk that you take when you subscribe to certain beliefs that have been shown scientifically and evidence-based, and just, from what we know about science, just not to be true. In terms of transmission, which transitions me into more conversation about what we're talking about, is that when we look at the number of people who have died, so here in the state of Maryland, for the entire month of June, 100% of the people who lost their lives to COVID here in Maryland, 100% of them were unvaccinated. 100% of them were unvaccinated. Of the cases of COVID here in the state of Maryland, 95% of them were among unvaccinated people, and 93% of those who were hospitalized were not vaccinated. And it makes sense when you think about the vaccine efficacy, right? As we know, the vaccines aren't 100%, but when you look at these numbers, 7% of the individuals who were admitted to the hospital were vaccinated. That pairs well with like the mRNA efficacy, right? So we know that both Pfizer and Moderna were somewhere between 93 to 96% effective. Initially, the data was about hospitalization and death. And so we expect that some folks, even in the face of a vaccination, are going to be hospitalized, likely because of some comorbid conditions, but that's the reality of it, right? But to look at those numbers just here in Maryland, and we're seeing the CDC reported that 99.5% of deaths across the country, looking at certain states, they didn't report out what states they looked at, but over a 6-month period of time, in the time that we have been doing this vaccination campaign, a group of states that they're looking at, and I'd be interested to see what those states are, right? Because it could also be, there could be some bias in the states. If they included like Vermont, all of like Maine, Vermont, Massachusetts, all the states that are like 60% or higher in terms of the vaccination rates, then the data is a little bit skewed. But 99.5% of those who have lost their lives to COVID in the past 6 months are the ones who have not been vaccinated. Like, that's not, for some people, they're like, oh, you guys are pumping up the numbers. Like, even if you don't, like, if you're like, okay, they inflated the numbers, let's say 80%. That's still good odds in terms of those of us who've been vaccinated being protected against hospitalization and death. Like, you can't argue that, right? And so that's what's most concerning, is that, as Dr. Fauci said, we are quickly becoming two Americas, right? The vaccinated America and the unvaccinated America. And it isn't just death from COVID, it's the long COVID complication. So you may only have a mild case of COVID, but that brain fog, right? The decreased lung capacity, all of those things that come with it, the increased risk of high blood pressure, diabetes, etc. So it isn't simply, well, the people I know haven't died from it, but look at the data to see what the risks are in terms of how they're doing after they have recovered. That's the other thing to consider as people contemplate whether or not they are going to get vaccinated. So those are the things that we have to take into consideration, all right? Any word of when the younger population, we're going to talk about it. We're definitely going to talk about it in terms of vaccination rates. Now, in terms of how are these cases being transmitted, particularly related to little ones under the age of 12, what we know based on the data, we know two things. One, that children serving as sort of the vector of infection is very, very low. Children are acquiring COVID from their grown-ups, but very rarely are children spreading COVID to their grown-ups. So the way that we protect our children is by masking up if you're not vaccinated, or getting your vaccine if you are open to doing that. That is how we protect our little ones, particularly the ones under the age of 12. Because part of the population that remains at risk, right, to COVID-19, particularly this Delta variant, are little ones under the age of 12. They can't get the vaccine. They can't get protected. So it is up to us as the adults and the adolescents, the pre-adolescents, and the grown-ups to get vaccinated so our little ones are protected. We do not yet know if the Delta variant impacts children any differently than any of the other COVID variants, the alpha, the beta, all of those. But what we do know is that because children under the age of 12 cannot get vaccinated, they are in that unvaccinated group that puts them at a higher risk of exposure and acquiring COVID-19. The blessing of it all, right, when we look at overall COVID-19 data, is that children under 10, even when exposed, are less likely to become symptomatic with COVID. But because we have not done an excellent job of monitoring children in the face of the Delta variant, we have not yet answered that question. Is the Delta variant associated with a higher risk compared to the original? Is the Delta variant associated with a higher risk of multisystem inflammatory syndrome compared to any of the other variants? A lot of our focus has been very adult specific. I, as a pediatrician, am very frustrated with the fact that we do not do a good enough job monitoring that information for our children to have a full understanding of what the difference is, if there are any, in terms of these various variants, and what the risk is for our little ones, both in terms of infection and in terms of complications. But that is an excellent question. In terms of vaccines under 12, we will talk about that in a little bit, and I'll definitely be able to answer that question. Let's talk a little bit about the Delta variant and where we are. Last week, there were 85 countries where the Delta variant existed. We are now at 105 countries that have shown evidence of the Delta variant. Almost every new case in the United Kingdom is because of the Delta variant. It quickly replaced the Alpha variant, which originated in the United Kingdom. But that's not stopping them from reopening. They're like, put your mask on, get your shot. We're doing this. And I'm not mad at them, because at this point, for the most part, I'll say it like that, for the most part, particularly here in the United States, if you want a shot, you can get a shot, right? Like Biden is he's providing door-to-door access for vaccines. There are people out here saying it's the Gestapo, it's Big Brother showing up. Like, they're not all up in your mix, going through your house, checking for guns. They're offering you the vaccine. Like, you don't have to schedule an appointment at CVS. You don't have to expend any gas, energy, or anything other than opening the door and be like, yeah, let's go. Alcohol swab me up. Give me the shot. That's what they're doing. This is like Public Health 101. It's taking it to the streets. It's the stuff I did in medical school. Like, it just gives me joy, because this is the stuff I did in medical school. Like, I had my little supply bag. I was in East LA, getting to practice my Spanish, talking to families about getting vaccinated and being able to schedule them vaccine appointments. The only thing we couldn't do at that time was actually deliver the vaccine. If we could have done it, it would have taken it to the next level. But if you ever travel outside of the United States, if you ever go to places in sub-Saharan Africa, if you go to places in India and other parts of Asia, this is what they do. They don't expect community members to figure out how to get a bus, get a car, get an Uber to go get a vaccine. They bring it to them. And that's what this federal government is attempting to do. But instead of appreciating it, folks are making it political and making it sound like, well, while they're there, they're going to check for your guns. They're going to check. No, they're not. No, they're not. They're showing up with swabs and shots. Swabs, shots, and a computer to log in that they gave it to you. That's it. That's it. So, it drives me bananas that people are making such a big deal about Public Health 101. Like, this is feet on the ground, boots hitting streets, doing the work. Like, if invited to do so, I'd be showing up, knocking on doors to offer the COVID-19 vaccine. We don't necessarily have to do that in my county, because my county did a rock star job for the most part of getting people vaccinated. But there are certain communities, and probably segments within my community, where they would benefit from that kind of a resource. Like, we should be grateful. We should be appreciative of the fact that we're removing all barriers. So anyone who wants a shot at this point should be able to get one. If you're not vaccinated at this point, it's because you're choosing not to, right? In my county, we're getting ready to send shots back to the government. We're getting ready to send shots back because folks are like, I'm good. Well, if we had supply, we wanted to give it to you, you chose not to, and we send it back, then come August, September, etc., you can't say, well, no, it's because I didn't have access. Especially if folks are showing up, knocking on your door to provide it to you, right? You can choose not to open the door. It's up to you. But what you cannot say is that it was not accessible to you at this point. Because for the most part, for the most part, unless your state government is doing something funky to prevent access, for the most part, you can't say that the federal government has not allowed access. They put in law that we can't charge people to give the vaccine. Insurance companies and healthcare providers cannot charge you for a COVID-19 vaccine. Anyone who's trying to charge you for a COVID-19 vaccine, cancel that appointment and go somewhere else, because it's against the law, right? There are actually fines that can be assessed for healthcare providers and insurance companies sending you a bill telling you you owe them anything for a COVID-19 vaccine. So cost is not an issue. Now access is not an issue. But what we do know is that in the states with the lowest vaccination rates, we are seeing higher numbers of cases, higher numbers of hospitalization, younger people being hospitalized, and a greater number of people dying. And I would hate for there to truly be two Americas where some of us are living our best lives, traveling, enjoying, just living it up, while others are continuously plagued with family members and themselves either being critically ill, sick, and dying. It's not right, and politics should not get in the way of public health. So this is a public service announcement for anyone who's allowing politics to get in the way of their decision to protect themselves and to protect their community. Reevaluate what the message is being delivered. Does that make sense? And how is it that the decision that you're making not to get vaccinated and not to wear a mask, right? Because it's usually both of those going hand in hand. It's not getting vaccinated and I don't need my mask. So do one or the other, right? But make sure that you're protecting yourself so that you don't end up in this 99.5% of the individuals who are suffering from COVID-19 simply because you've made a choice to subscribe to certain information. And I get it. Some folks are like, I still am not yet ready. I get it. I don't poo-poo your decision, but what I will compel you to do is to at least wear a mask, because we don't know everyone's vaccination status. All right. So I guess I had two soapboxes tonight. Let me make sure I haven't missed anything, because I had to say that. I had to say that. Absolutely. So, Mr. Cox said some chakras. We need more than chakras. We need chakras. We need a whole lot of, we need some common sense. We need a real strong infusion of common sense. My family, and I'm fully transparent. I love my family to pieces. I grew up in a very conservative Republican family from the Bible Belt. A good number of African Americans living in the Bible Belt grow up Republican, because when you think about it, before Reconstruction, during Reconstruction, that's how we identified, before the KKK and white supremacists flipped the script, killed us who ran for office, and then infiltrated the Republican Party, and here we are now. And I understand it, because my aunt, I hear conversations that my aunt has about some of the things she hears in the news that she watches about some of these things. And so sometimes you have to be very cautious of what you strongly believe in, you pursue, right? So if you already believe a thing, you are likely to only read what fortifies what you believe, which is why I don't often watch like super, super liberal news, right? Because I'm like, yeah, that's what I believe too. Sometimes I will delve into the other side just to hear, and I listen to it, not to be like, but really to have a clear understanding of different people's perspectives. My goal is to only focus on news like from NPR. I don't want to hear extremes of on either side, but really straightforward, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. But it's important to have a clear understanding of what your biases are, even in how you interpret news, to understand, is it my bias that's influencing my decision, or am I truly appreciating the science and evidence behind what I'm hearing? All right. And so that's my biggest ask of folks, is to really pay attention to that. All right. Let's see, where are the best resources? Excellent question. We'll talk about resources when we get to the end, so that people can, vet where they are getting their information, because it truly should be simply the facts. And it's hard. Like, we'll talk about the CDC and why sometimes I raise my eyebrow at them, especially with their recommendation when we talk about children, their recommendation of children and teachers who are fully vaccinated not having to wear their mask. No, don't follow that. All right. So right now here in the United States, the Delta variant accounts for 58% of COVID-19 infections. 58%. So we have seen this bad boy either doubling or increasing at least by a good 20 to 30% every single week. In terms of infectivity, you guys already know it's more transmissible than even the alpha variant, somewhere between 40 to 60% more transmissible than the alpha variant, which was almost twice as transmissible or infectious as the original COVID-19. And it's because it's stickier. It sticks to your oral pharynx much more easily, and it can penetrate through the cell and cause a more rapid rate of replication in terms of causing infection. So that's one of the reasons why we see it causing so many more infections than even the alpha variant. We talked last week, the symptoms to look out for are very similar to a pretty significant cold, which for a lot of people, it's like, oh, I just have a cold. No, you might have the Delta variant. So it's important for us to not, and that might be one of the reasons why testing has gone down, is because a lot of people are believing that they either have a cold, they're experiencing allergies, right? We're seeing the uptick of the cold virus coming up because a lot of us have not worn our masks in a long time. But if you feel the tickle, you feel the cough, you've got headaches, it just feels like a really achy, yucky cold, I would highly recommend that you get tested to make sure that you do not have COVID, particularly the Delta variant. We know that we have to make sure that we're protecting our little ones under the age of 12. They should still be wearing a mask. Our immunocompromised folks who may not have been able to get the COVID-19 vaccine need to continue to be protected, particularly against this variant. So what do? You get vaccinated if you're comfortable in doing so. If you're not yet comfortable in doing so, and if you've been vaccinated, everybody should still wear a mask when you are indoors around people where you do not know their vaccination status. There are a couple of variants that we have to keep an eye on. One of the ones we mentioned last week was the Delta Plus. Yes, there's a Delta Plus. Same mutation in the spike protein as the Delta variant, but then an additional mutation along that same area within the spike protein, which is why they did not call it a completely new name, but that it's sort of, it's an additional, it's a plus mutation. Not any different thus far in terms of infectious rate or severity than the Delta variant. It's just noted that there's an additional mutation. Now, the reason why they have to pay attention to it is that, say, for instance, the Delta mutation and then this plus mutation, and then there's another mutation that adds on to it. That's why we have to pay close attention to it, because if all of these mutations start to add up and then change the structure of the spike protein, change how the spike protein works inside the body, that becomes even more concerning. There is now, we talked about before, the Lambda variant. It has not yet fully penetrated the United States. There have only been 668 Lambda documented infections here in the United States. They have not identified the states in which these cases have happened, but for the most part, it has been localized to South America. We've seen a couple of cases in Israel, in Turkey, and I believe there have been a handful of cases in the United Kingdom. No difference in infectivity compared to the Delta variant. But what we do know based on preliminary studies that have not yet been published is that all of the vaccines respond very well to the Lambda variant. There also the Epsilon that came out of California. It's now just a variant of interest, not concern. Now there's a Kappa variant. We have not heard any significant information about the Kappa variant, but I wanted to make sure that I mention it to you so that as information comes about, I'll be able to inform you and you would have heard it here first, all right? The WHO continues to recommend that we wear masks indoors, even though the CDC is on a whole different page. We're following WHO guidelines, right? Right, all right. So let me scroll, make sure I didn't miss anything. Very good. I'm so happy that folks are still wearing masks. We're absolutely going through the Greek alphabet. It's a good refresher for an old head like myself. I was like, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon. I sang my song. I digress. But it was because of my phenomenal prophytes that I can actually still remember that song, right? Thank you, prophytes. All right, let's talk vaccinations and where we are. We have now at least 184 million Americans have received their vaccines here in this good old US of A. In terms of percentage, close to 68% of individuals 18 and older have received at least one dose. 65% of those 12 and older have received at least one dose. And almost 56% of the population has received at least one dose. And of the population, it's of the people who will be or are eligible to get the vaccine. In terms of full vaccination, 160 million people are now vaccinated. 18 and older, we're at 59% of us have been fully vaccinated. That's close to where Israel was when the Delta variant showed up. So collectively as a country, we are in a good place. For those who are 12 and older, 56% of us are fully vaccinated. And in terms of everyone who's eligible to get vaccinated, and those who will be, 48% of us have been vaccinated against COVID-19. In terms of who's getting vaccinated, how many of us, we're dropping really low. Only about 55 million people a day, or 550,000 people a day are getting vaccinated. Our peak was 3.3 million. We're now at 550,000. So clearly there's more work to be done in terms of getting people vaccinated, which is why the Biden administration decided to go door to door. All right. In terms of the leading states, Vermont's knocking out of the park. 67% of the state is fully vaccinated of those who are eligible to get the vaccine, followed by by Massachusetts, who's doing an excellent job, Maine, Connecticut, Rhode Island, go New England states, and then Hawaii at 53%. They lead the country. In terms of the states that need to get a little bit of act right, Mississippi has the lowest rates of vaccination, followed by Louisiana, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Alabama, Arkansas, and Georgia. Come on, South. Come on. Let's go. And then the Midwest collectively, Wyoming, Missouri, those states. All right. So if you live in one of those states, make sure you're talking to your folks about getting vaccinated. If you have family, friends in those states, make sure that they know what their risks are in deciding not to get vaccinated. All right. In terms of vaccinations by race, it's almost Leo season, so I pulled my mug out. Almost a couple of weeks. In terms of vaccination rates by race, African Americans make up the smallest percentage of people who have been vaccinated in the country. We make up around 12.4% of the country's population, but only 9% of those who have been vaccinated. Whites make up about 60% of the population of this country. They make up 60% of the individuals who have been vaccinated. And same with the Latinx and the Asian population here in the country. Their vaccination rates are very comparable to their population percentage rates here in this country. So I need my Black brothers and sisters. We got to do this, right? We have to protect ourselves. We're already dealing with a lot of health disparities. What we do not want to do is perpetuate those health disparities by choosing not to get vaccinated. One of the things I wanted to talk about was boosters. This is a question that I have gotten. I was just on the Black News Channel 2 days ago, and I was on the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon just yesterday talking about boosters. Are we going to need to get boosters, especially with these case numbers increasing? Thus far, the answer still is no. The CDC will likely not suggest a booster until one of two things happen. The first is that what we will see is that there's declining protection against the vaccine, right? Not just in terms of antibodies. The antibody response to a vaccine is supposed to go down over time. The circulating antibodies, I might add. Circulating antibodies are supposed to come down over time. How quickly those antibodies come down over time is based on how effective the vaccine is. Particularly with the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine being greater than 90% effective, that means it's going to take a longer amount of time for our circulating antibodies to come down. Thus far, 6 months, 7 months out, we're still looking excellent for all of the variants, because it's not just circulating antibodies that provide us with an immune response. It's our memory cells, our T cells, and our memory B cells. Our memory B cells are what show up to push out antibodies later on. COVID shows up again, memory B cells are like, I recognize you. Boom, antibodies are released, right? And then T cells are like, I smell this, it smells familiar. Let's show up, show out and kill. Those also have to be reduced in order for us to truly say that the vaccines no longer work. And that has not been the case with Pfizer, Moderna, or Johnson & Johnson, all right? The second way that the CDC will say absolutely a booster shot is needed is if there's like an escape variant. It sounds like an escape prisoner. It sort of is. If there is a variant, one version of COVID that is like the biggest, baddest version of COVID we've ever seen, that completely just defies our immune response, right? The spike protein changes so much that it is no longer recognizable. Imagine HIV and the early HIV drugs, right? HIV was able to change so much that these drugs didn't even have a receptor to bind to kill it anymore. That's how brilliant HIV was in being able to like shapeshift, right? It was like, oh, okay, AZT. Now the body doesn't respond to AZT anymore because AZT no longer has anywhere to attach to the virus to now cause it to die. If we get to a place where there's a COVID-19 shapeshifter where no part of our immune system is able to recognize it and the vaccine no longer triggers a response for our bodies to respond to it, that's when we're going to need a booster. Those two scenarios have not happened yet. The way that those scenarios will happen is if we continue to allow COVID-19 to replicate, because as you guys know, I always say, the more a virus replicates, the more it mutates. The more it mutates, the higher the likelihood is that we will get the ship-shifting COVID-19 that completely defies our natural immune response if you've had COVID-19 before, or the vaccine-triggered immune response. We want to make sure enough people get vaccinated so that we don't have to worry about the COVID-19 shapeshifter, all right? So that's what we have to pay attention to. The other way that, the third way that the CDC might recommend a booster sooner than those two worst case scenarios happen is specifically in immunocompromised patients, right? We do know that immunocompromised patients have a decreased immune response in a faster period of time simply because of immunocompromise, particularly for patients who are actively receiving cancer treatments, chemotherapy to be specific, or patients who are post-transplant and they're on very strong immunosuppressant drugs. Those two populations may be the only populations right now where the CDC may consider giving them a booster shot. But even now, they have not yet come out with a recommendation to state that that population will receive a booster. And I know you guys have probably heard a lot of conversation about Johnson & Johnson. There was a virologist recently who talked about the fact that she moved from the U.S. to Canada and she got her Pfizer booster because she had gotten the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And what she was worried about was a breakthrough infection where she would end up creating a COVID super spreader, right? Like she'd have that shape-shifting COVID-19 because she ended up getting an infection in the face of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine because of some evidence associated with the AstraZeneca vaccine. She was out of order. There's no evidence, there's no data that says anybody who received the Johnson & Johnson vaccine should get a Pfizer, Moderna booster, right? You don't need to be topped off with an mRNA vaccine. We don't know how effective it would be to do that. Studies are still happening now. We don't know what the side effect and the adverse outcomes would be by mixing and matching them. We don't know any of that information yet. And until we know that information, I would not suggest that anyone who's gotten the Johnson & Johnson vaccine sign up to get their Pfizer or their Moderna booster, right? The other issue is availability of vaccine. If we have a large percentage of our population in certain areas that have not gotten vaccinated, and then we start issuing out the booster, will we then create access issues for people who eventually decide to get vaccinated who now can't because we even sucked up all the booster shots, right? So those are the things that we have to think about as it relates to getting the booster, all right? One thing I want to talk about before we jump into kids and I hop off is Johnson & Johnson, an update there. Some of you may have seen that there was a recent news release from the FDA about Guillain-Barre and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. I know you're like, oh, sis, not again, not more adverse events. Yeah, but as more people get the shot, more information is acquired and we have a better sense of what's going on. So there has been a slight increase in the rates of Guillain-Barre syndrome associated with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine compared to the general population. Not as significant, but significant enough for them to issue out a press release. It looks like it's anywhere between a 3 to 5 times higher risk of Guillain-Barre in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine population than compared to the general population. But I'm going to put a star next to that. I'm going to put it in quotes because you also have risk of Guillain-Barre in association with the COVID-19 infection. So comparing the vaccinated population to the general population is absolutely appropriate to have a clear understanding of if there is an increased risk. And yes, there is a slight, but an increased one. But you also have to compare the risk of these adverse outcomes in the vaccinated population to the risk of the same outcome in the infectious population. If you had COVID, what is your risk of Guillain-Barre? The answer is we don't know yet, but we know that there is a risk. There have been several studies looking at patients coming out of recovery from COVID-19 and them having developed Guillain-Barre. It's usually in an older population. It's usually associated with the male gender. So if you are an older male, 60 years and older, and you are in the market for a vaccine, there is a slight risk or higher risk of Guillain-Barre in that population. They're usually seeing the development of Guillain-Barre around 11 days after having received the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. But the symptoms and severity of the Guillain-Barre were very similar to what we saw for people who developed Guillain-Barre with COVID-19. So you have to really weigh all of that information when you're making a decision about getting vaccinated. But you guys know I'm not going to hold this from you. Every time I hear information about side effects and adverse outcomes, I'm coming to you directly to let you know so that you can make an informed decision about, one, whether or not to get vaccinated, and two, if you have an option in terms of what vaccination to opt for. The Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices will be meeting on July 22nd next week to discuss the 100 cases that have thus far been identified, to confirm them as Guillain-Barre cases, to determine the timing of the onset of Guillain-Barre in association with the vaccine, to determine whether or not there's any causal link between the vaccine and receiving and developing Guillain-Barre. Are there any other common denominators? Were they on aspirin? Because you can get Guillain-Barre by taking aspirin. You can get Guillain-Barre from the flu. You can get Guillain-Barre from catching a cold. So are there any other common denominators other than receiving the vaccine that may explain why these cases have developed among this population? And then it will likely be in the same way that the CDC put a warning label on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine in terms of blood clots. If it ends up showing that there's causality, they will likely put a warning on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine to include that language. But what they are also going to do is calculate out the risk of Guillain-Barre associated with the vaccine with the benefits of the vaccine and compare that with the risks related to COVID-19 in order to make an informed decision. And I can almost guarantee you they're still going to recommend that people get vaccinated with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, but keeping an eye out for what's going on in terms of Guillain-Barre. So that's what's going on there in terms of some of the concerns we have around the vaccine. In terms of our little ones, this will be where we wrap up because I think it's important for us to talk about it. In terms of our little ones, for those who can get vaccinated, as of July 7th, 7 million children, 12 years and older, have received their COVID-19 vaccines, fully vaccinated. 36% of those little ones that are 16 and older, 24% of our little ones who are between the ages of 12 to 15. So the CDC, when they're reporting their data out, they're cutting children off at like 17, 18 and older. They're considering them to be adults. So 36% of those between the ages of 16 and 17 and 24% of those between the ages of 12 to 15 who can get this vaccine. Those are the numbers. Parents are weighing the risks and benefits and getting the vaccine, particularly with the concerns around myocarditis, but we've talked before about the risks and benefits of myocarditis. I did a separate video specifically talking about myocarditis, the risks associated with it, with the mRNA vaccines. I certainly need to make an update because we've gotten more information, but for anyone who has questions about myocarditis and pericarditis associated with the vaccine, those videos are publicly available on my Yolanda Hancock and my Dr. Yolanda Hancock Facebook pages. In terms of the little ones under the age of 12, so our 5 to 11, because that's going to be the next age group where both Pfizer, Moderna, and likely Johnson & Johnson are going to be pushing out vaccine availability, is going to be in the fall. It will likely coincide with the start of the school year. It's going to be very interesting trying to get little ones vaccinated at the beginning of the school year with getting them in school at the beginning of the school year. The CDC just mentioned this week, which blew my mind, that fully vaccinated children and adults, educators, administrators, don't have to wear a mask. No, don't do that. Put your mask on. Because one, we know that asymptomatic folks who have been vaccinated can still spread it. Two, there are individuals who are fully vaccinated who can get sick and get pretty significantly sick, a very small percentage, but it's still like, why roll the dice when all you have to do is wear a mask, right? So we're looking at the fall for 5 to 11-year-olds. They're anticipating 6-month-old to 4-year, 11-month-olds being able to get the vaccine in the winter of 2021 or the early part of the winter of 2022. There has not been a lot of movement. They're still in the midst of clinical trials, but what we will likely see is both Pfizer will do it first because they're always ahead of the curve, ahead of Moderna. Pfizer will likely submit their EUA in August, likely within the first couple of weeks of August, for the vaccine to be evaluated and then approved for emergency use authorization, likely the latter part of August, beginning of September. You will soon see Moderna probably about a month later available for our little ones. There hasn't been a lot of data being pushed out with Johnson & Johnson, so the question remains as to where Johnson & Johnson will be among the top 3 vaccines that we're using here in the U.S. as it relates to our little ones. For our children, our preteens, and our young adults, for a lot of parents, it's really having a clear understanding of whether or not they should get vaccinated, right? We know compared to adults, children, preteens, teens, and young adults have not been disproportionately impacted by COVID compared to adults. But when you compare COVID to influenza and comparing children to children, we do see that there is a difference in impact with COVID compared to flu. And I've talked about this before. In our worst flu seasons, we've lost max of about 190 children in a flu season. We lost over 260 children to COVID at the 12-month mark. Thus far, we've lost a little over 300 children to COVID since this pandemic began. 75% of those children were either Black or brown. And as this Delta variant continues to penetrate in certain areas, certain neighborhoods, what we are going to see is that number steadily increase, right? Because COVID only has certain populations to infect, because those particularly 65 and older, even 55 and older, have been doing a bang-up job in terms of getting vaccinated and protected. The virus has nowhere else to go but into our younger populations, which is the reason, as a mother, that I will feel comfortable with my 8-year-old getting vaccinated. Will she be one of the first to get her sleeves rolled up? No, y'all know what I will be doing is looking at the data. I waited until 10% of the population was fully vaccinated before I got my shot, and I paid attention to the information coming out of theirs. I will be doing the same thing for my 8-year-old daughter, and I will be coming to you and talking to you guys about how I am going through making that decision so that she is protected. In the meantime, in between time, I'm wearing a mask to protect myself and to protect her. She's wearing her mask. We had a recent scare. I had a fuss. Y'all, I'm very transparent. She was with family. I let her go with family. Family decided to take her to like a little indoor amusement park. Folks decided she didn't need to wear her mask. I had to do my Reiki self-healing. I had to go on a run. I think I did 6 miles of run that day because I had to release that angry energy. Because in Reiki, we have certain Reiki principles. Just for today, I release thoughts and feelings of anger is the first one I start with. And so I had to literally physically do that because now I got to worry about whether or not my child has been exposed to the Delta variant. So just like you, I go through these same experiences where I might be hypervigilant, but the people that your children are around are not as much. They take a lot of liberties. And knowing that, whenever I can get her vaccinated, I certainly will once those thresholds are met so that I don't have to cuss my family out. No, I ain't cuss them out. In my head, I did. But y'all know what I'm talking about. These are the things that we work through as parents. And for someone to do that with my kid, right? Of all the kids to have out in an indoor environment with no mask, like y'all, you know what I talk about every week. You know what I talk about every day. And to have my baby out there with no mask on, it really required me to call on Jesus. Y'all know I love Jesus, but I cuss a little bit, sometimes a little bit. But this time I didn't, because I'm working on maintaining the evenness of my emotions, all right? Maintaining my peace so that the Holy Spirit can continue to dwell in me. All right, y'all. So that's where we are with all of the information that I have. Do not ever hesitate to reach out ask your questions. If there's certain things you want me to cover, please let me know. Keep the, they were out of pocket. They were so out of pocket. Oh, I won't mention who it was. They know who they are. You're watching this now. But yeah, so now she got to get tested, and now I got to deal with my 8-year-old getting swabbed now for her camp, and then getting swabbed next week. It's a whole thing, right? But these are the things, when we as adults make certain decisions, we have to understand the collateral damage that it causes, right? And so now my little one gets to have a swab stuck up her nose tomorrow for camp, and then later on in a couple of days to make sure she wasn't exposed to the COVID cootie while having big fun and unmasked. So there you go. All right. So yes, I live it too. Like, I'm not just practicing it. I'm not just preaching it. I'm practicing it, and I'm experiencing some of the same frustrations that you guys may be experiencing. I'm going through some of the same challenges, having some of the same conversations that you guys are having. With all of this expertise and knowledge, right? It doesn't matter. Credentials don't matter. These things, we just have to talk to each other in a loving, respectful way, praying and hoping that it sinks in at least a little bit, right? So that it marinates in people's spirits and they eventually do the right thing, all right? So y'all love on each other, protect each other, be your brothers, your sisters, your daughters, your sons, your nieces, your nephews, your cousins' keepers, so that we all get through this pandemic with our full health, physical, mental, spiritual, relational, all of that, all right? I'll see you guys. Next, more sources. Yes, Prophet, I almost forgot. So sometimes the CDC serves as a good source, sometimes not, right? What I would say to do is go to your academic resources, the Johns Hopkins, the Harvards, the Yales, the UCLAs, the George Washingtons, any academic institution that pushes out information related to the pandemic is going to be a trusted source. I wish that I could say health departments, but as we've seen through this pandemic, depending on the state you live in, the health department can be muzzled, and the way that data can be released can be questionable, right? So I like to go to places like NPR. NPR reports out just basic facts. It's public, right? It's the public source of information. Any Post, Times, any of those things, pay attention to who wrote the article, what their background is. There are a couple of folks who write articles still with a little bit of spin on it, right? But any academic institution, a lot of my information that I get comes from Hopkins, my alma mater. It comes from Harvard, because they have institutions, organizations that are simply there to look at the data, right? To evaluate the data, to see what the numbers show, what are the trends, what we need to be looking out for. So any academic institution in your state, public universities are good sources of information. Sometimes the private ones, depending on who's funding them, it can be a little bit tricky, but those are the places that I get the majority of my information. I also look at the articles that are coming out, right? So when you look at a Washington Post, a New York Times, a Business Insider even, they will sometimes give you the link to the article. Read it. If you have questions about it, you need any assistance sort of critically analyzing these JAMA, New England Journal of Medicine articles, don't ever hesitate to reach out so that we can sort of talk through what it is you are reading about. Those are the sources that help me. All right. I hope that you guys find me as a trusted source. You know, I'm going to keep it real with you, let you know all the information that I find, even if it may counter some of the information that I may have said before. If there are corrections, I will not hesitate to pivot, provide correction, and let you guys know what's going on, all right? Get my sip of tea. Enjoy the rest of your week. I will see you guys next week, if not sooner. Love you guys. See you next week. Mwah. Dr. Yola out.